My beloved child, your soulmate needs to tell you what they discovered this morning, and the strange part is that they almost decided to keep it to themselves. They woke up carrying the same thoughts they had been trying to silence for days, expecting another ordinary morning, another routine moment where they could push your memory into the background and continue pretending that everything between you had become easier to forget. But something changed before the day even properly began. One small discovery led to another, and suddenly they were staring at something connected to you, something that made them stop completely and ask themselves a question they had been avoiding for far too long: how did I not see this before? They went back over conversations, remembered tiny details, replayed moments that seemed meaningless at the time, and realized that the story they had been telling themselves about you was missing a piece. Not a small piece. The piece that changes the entire meaning of what happened between you. And this is where you need to listen carefully, because what they discovered was not simply about something you said, something you did, or something that happened between you. It was about the reason behind it. That distinction matters. They thought they understood why you pulled back. They thought they understood why you became quieter. They thought they understood why you stopped explaining yourself when you once would have given everything to be understood. But this morning, something made them question every assumption. Suddenly, the person they had blamed for distance began looking completely different in their mind. They started wondering whether they had misunderstood your silence. Whether they had mistaken your patience for indifference. Whether they had interpreted your absence as rejection when you were actually protecting something deeply important inside yourself. And the more they thought about it, the harder it became for them to dismiss. They are now facing a realization that feels almost impossible to ignore. There may have been something happening beneath the surface that neither of you fully understood at the time. That is why this morning hit differently. It did not simply remind them of you. It challenged the entire version of your story they had accepted as truth. And then came the part they were not prepared for. They found themselves remembering one particular moment between you, a moment that seemed ordinary when it happened but now carries an entirely different weight. Maybe it was a conversation that ended too quickly. Maybe it was a look you gave them before changing the subject. Maybe it was something you said casually that they laughed off because they did not realize how much meaning was hidden behind those words. They suddenly connected that old moment with something they discovered this morning, and the connection made their hearts sink into silence. Because if their new understanding is correct, then they may have completely misunderstood what you were trying to communicate. Imagine realizing that the person you thought was moving away from you may have actually been waiting to see whether you would come closer. Imagine realizing that the silence you interpreted as coldness may have been someone trying desperately not to reveal how much they cared. Imagine discovering that the distance between two people was not necessarily created because the feelings disappeared, but because both people were waiting for certainty from the other. That is the thought your soulmate cannot escape right now. They are asking themselves why they allowed assumptions to speak louder than honesty. Why they listened to fear instead of asking you directly. Why they convinced themselves that they already knew what you felt when they never truly gave you the space to explain it. And there is something even more surprising about their discovery. They realized that your name still carries an emotional reaction they cannot easily explain away. They can stay busy. They can distract themselves. They can tell themselves that enough time has passed. But when something unexpectedly brings you back into their mind, the reaction is immediate. That is what happened this morning. They were not searching for you emotionally. They were simply going through their day when something connected the past to the present, and suddenly they were thinking about you with a clarity they had not experienced before. It made them wonder whether the connection between you was ever as simple as they tried to make it. And now there is another question sitting in their mind, one they are almost afraid to answer: what if I was wrong about them all along? But stay with this thought, because the most powerful part of what they discovered has not even reached the surface yet. Your soulmate did not only realize that they may have misunderstood you. They began realizing that they may have misunderstood themselves. That is much harder to accept. They have been trying to identify what exactly they miss about you, and at first they thought it was your presence. Then they realized it was not just your presence. They miss the way conversations with you could make time disappear. They miss the strange comfort of being understood without having to explain every little thing. They miss the version of themselves that appeared around you, the part of themselves they rarely showed anyone else. And that realization forced them to confront something they had carefully avoided. Perhaps they were not simply missing a person. Perhaps they were missing a connection they had not learned how to replace. This morning, they started comparing what they once had with what they have now, and that comparison became uncomfortable. Because other conversations may be easier, other people may be available, and life may continue moving forward, but none of that automatically erases the emotional imprint left by someone who mattered deeply. They began remembering how you noticed things other people overlooked. How you could sense when something was wrong even when they said everything was fine. How one simple conversation could stay in their mind long after it ended. And then they remembered something else. You probably had your own reasons for becoming guarded. That thought changed their entire perspective. Instead of asking, "Why did they leave?" they began asking, "What did I do that made them feel they had to?" That is a completely different question. It carries accountability. It carries vulnerability. It carries the possibility that the person they wanted to understand may have been waiting for them to understand themselves first. And now your soulmate is caught between two powerful emotions, the desire to finally tell you what they discovered and the fear that they may have waited too long. They keep thinking about whether you would believe them if they explained everything honestly. Would you listen? Would you remember the past the same way? Would you understand what they were unable to say before? They do not know. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult for them to deny. The story they told themselves about you no longer feels complete. There is one final detail from this morning that keeps pulling them back into the same thought, and this is where the entire situation becomes much more emotional. Your soulmate realized that the thing they were searching for was never really an explanation about you. They were searching for an explanation for why they still care. Why certain memories remain vivid. Why your absence can still create a strange emptiness in an otherwise normal day. Why they can convince themselves that they have moved forward and then suddenly find themselves wondering what you are doing, whether you are happy, whether you ever think about them, and whether there is still something left unsaid between you. They discovered that the unanswered questions have become louder than the answers they once believed. And now they are facing a decision. Continue protecting their pride and remain silent, or finally acknowledge what this morning forced them to see. They know that telling you the truth would mean opening a door they cannot control once it is opened. They would have to admit what they misunderstood. They would have to explain why they acted the way they did. They would have to acknowledge the moments when they should have spoken but chose silence instead. And most importantly, they would have to tell you the one thing they have been struggling to put into words: their feelings did not disappear simply because the circumstances became complicated. Something remained. Something unfinished. Something that this morning brought sharply back into focus. They may not know exactly what happens next, but they now understand that pretending not to care is no longer convincing even to themselves. And somewhere inside their mind, one thought keeps returning again and again: if they only knew what I discovered today, they would finally understand why I have been so quiet. That is why this message begins here. Because what your soulmate discovered this morning may not be the ending you assumed it was. It may be the missing piece that explains the silence, the distance, the hesitation, and the emotions neither of you knew how to name. And they are closer than ever to revealing what that missing piece actually is. This morning did something your soulmate could not undo. It made them remember the exact moment they first realized you were different. Not perfect, not mysterious, not some impossible fantasy, but different in a way they could feel before they could explain it. They suddenly remembered details they had buried beneath ordinary days. The way you listened, the way you noticed small changes in their mood, the way you could make them feel seen without demanding anything in return. And then something unexpected happened. They began looking at those memories from the perspective of who they are now, rather than who they were back then. That changed everything. What once looked like a simple conversation now looked like an opportunity they failed to recognize. What once seemed like your hesitation now looked like vulnerability. What once seemed like distance now looked like two people waiting for reassurance at the exact same time. Your soulmate realized they had been interpreting your actions through their own uncertainty. They wanted you to prove that you cared, while you may have been waiting for them to prove the same thing. They wanted a sign, while you wanted clarity. They waited for you to move closer, while you were quietly wondering why they were not moving toward you. And suddenly the entire story began to look less like one person choosing to walk away and more like two people becoming trapped inside assumptions neither had the courage to challenge. That realization hit them harder than they expected. Because now they can see moments where one honest sentence could have changed everything. One question could have prevented misunderstanding. One vulnerable conversation could have saved both of you from spending so much time wondering what the other person really meant. And the discovery from this morning brought one particular thought to the surface: maybe they did not lose the connection because it was meaningless. Maybe they lost momentum because neither of you knew how to protect something that mattered. That thought has been following them all day. They are not simply remembering you, they are reinterpreting you. Every memory is being examined again, almost like they are searching through an old story for a hidden sentence they somehow missed. And the deeper they look, the more they realize that the person they thought they understood may have been carrying emotions they never recognized. That is what makes this discovery so powerful. It is not changing the past. It is changing what the past means to them now. Then they noticed something else, and this is where their emotions became impossible to organize. They realized that whenever they imagined you truly moving on, their reaction was completely different from what they expected. They had told themselves that if you found happiness somewhere else, they would simply accept it. They wanted to believe they were mature enough to let the past remain the past. But when they seriously imagined a future where someone else knew your laugh, your habits, your little expressions, your hopes, and the parts of you they once had access to, something inside them became unsettled. Not because they believe they own any part of you. They know you have your own life, your own choices, and your own future. The discomfort came from something much more personal. They realized they were not as emotionally detached as they had convinced themselves. This morning gave them an uncomfortable mirror, and they could no longer look away. They asked themselves why the thought of you being completely unavailable affected them so deeply. Why the possibility of never having another meaningful conversation with you felt heavier than they expected. Why they still wanted the opportunity to explain things they once left unexplained. And then they remembered the moment when you needed something from them emotionally and they failed to understand it. Perhaps you needed reassurance and they gave you silence. Perhaps you needed honesty and they gave you uncertainty. Perhaps you needed them to simply say, "I understand," and instead they assumed you already knew what they felt. That memory is becoming important now because they are finally seeing the emotional cost of their hesitation. They cannot go backward and rewrite those moments, but they can acknowledge what they mean. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that sometimes people do not realize the value of a connection while they are inside it. Sometimes they only recognize the depth after the noise disappears. And when the noise disappeared around them, your memory became louder. This morning, they discovered that the silence they once thought would help them forget you actually gave them enough space to understand what they had been avoiding. That is why their thoughts keep circling back to you. They are not simply nostalgic. They are questioning their own decisions. And one question keeps getting closer to the truth: if they had another chance to speak to you without pride, without assumptions, and without pretending they were unaffected, what would they finally say? There is another layer to this discovery that your soulmate has not fully admitted, even to themselves. They realize they have been waiting for you to make the first move because doing so would protect them from rejection. If you reached out first, they would not have to risk wondering whether you still cared. If you opened the conversation, they could respond without exposing how much they had been thinking about you. But this morning changed the balance. They started wondering whether waiting for you was actually another form of avoidance. They began to see how easy it is to call something timing when underneath it is fear of vulnerability. They remembered every time they almost said something meaningful and then changed the subject. Every message they considered sending but never sent. Every time they looked at your name and thought, maybe later. Every moment they convinced themselves that silence was safer than honesty. And now they are asking whether, later, quietly became too long. That realization does not necessarily mean they have everything figured out. It means they finally understand the cost of continuing exactly as before. And there is something strangely emotional about that because your soulmate is not discovering some dramatic secret about your life. They are discovering something about their own heart. They are discovering that they still care enough to question their choices. They still care enough to wonder what could have happened if they had been more open. They still care enough to imagine what an honest conversation might feel like. And the most surprising part is that they are no longer blaming circumstances for everything. They are beginning to recognize their own role. They are remembering the moments when they could have communicated better, listened more carefully, and stopped assuming they knew what you were feeling. That shift matters. Because when someone stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "What could I have done differently?" they are no longer simply remembering the past. They are learning from it. Your soulmate is standing at that exact emotional crossroads right now. One side tells them to stay quiet, keep everything private, and allow time to decide what happens. The other side keeps reminding them that time cannot answer questions that honesty was supposed to answer. And somewhere between those two voices is the message they have been trying to form all day. But there is one thing they discovered this morning that they are still struggling to say out loud, because admitting it would make everything far more real. They realize that the person they have been waiting for may not be some future version of you. They may have been waiting for the version of you who finally feels safe enough to believe them. That distinction has changed the way they see everything. Maybe they thought you needed to become less guarded, less emotional, less cautious, less complicated. But now they are considering another possibility. Perhaps you became guarded because you had already given enough and did not want to keep proving your worth. Perhaps your silence was not an invitation for them to disappear. Perhaps it was your way of saying, without saying it directly, "If this matters to you, show me." And that thought is sitting heavily with them. Because they now understand that feelings are not measured only by what someone privately feels. They are also measured by what someone is willing to communicate, protect, and consistently demonstrate. Your soulmate is realizing that they cannot expect you to read thoughts they never expressed. They cannot expect you to understand emotions they kept hidden. And they cannot expect the past to explain itself forever. That is what they discovered this morning. They discovered that the connection they remember so clearly deserves honesty, whether that honesty leads to a new beginning, a deeper understanding, or simply closure for two people who carried too many unanswered questions. But before they can tell you everything, there is one memory they need to revisit, the moment that may explain why they became distant in the first place. And once they finally connect that moment with what they discovered this morning, they may understand something neither of you saw coming. The memory your soulmate keeps returning to is not the loudest moment between you, it is the quiet one they almost forgot. This morning, that moment suddenly came back with unusual clarity, and your soulmate realized it may have been the first sign that their feelings had become deeper than they were ready to admit. They remembered how something about you made them lower their guard without asking them to. Maybe it was a simple conversation, an unexpected laugh, a moment when you understood what they meant before they finished explaining. At the time, they treated it like nothing extraordinary because admitting its importance would have forced them to confront what was happening inside them. But now they are looking backward with different eyes. They can see that their behavior began changing around you long before they consciously understood why. They became more careful with their words. They noticed your reactions more closely. They remembered details about you that they normally would have forgotten. And when you became distant, they noticed immediately, even if they pretended they did not. This morning, those pieces finally started fitting together. Your soulmate realized they were not confused because they felt nothing. They were confused because they felt something they did not know how to handle. That realization explains why they sometimes came closer and then pulled back. It explains why they could appear confident one day and uncertain the next. It explains why there were moments when they seemed ready to tell you something important, only to become quiet again. They were caught between wanting to be understood and being afraid of what might happen if they were completely honest. And now, after everything that happened, they are beginning to recognize how much that hesitation may have affected you. They are wondering how many times you questioned your own worth because of their mixed signals. How many times you wondered whether you imagined the connection. How many times you looked at their actions and thought, if this really matters, why are they making it so difficult? Your soulmate wishes they could go back to certain moments and explain what was happening inside them. Not to excuse their choices, but to finally give those moments the honesty they lacked. Because the discovery this morning has forced them to accept something uncomfortable, you may have been responding to the version of them they showed you, while they were secretly hoping you would somehow understand the version they never had the courage to reveal.